Welcome. Tonight we uncover a story from 1847 Georgia that historians tried to bury, the strange and dangerous pact made by twin sisters who chose loyalty, rebellion, and a forbidden bond over the expectations placed upon them from birth. Their decision shook an entire plantation, challenged the power structure they were raised to uphold, and left behind a mystery that still sparks debate today. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and hit subscribe, because it takes a huge amount of time, research, and digging through real historical records to bring these forgotten stories back to life. The twins were born into a world where every rule, expectation, and boundary had already been written for them long before they took their first breath. On the plantation in rural Georgia, they were known simply as the sisters, identical in face and voice, but different in temperament. From childhood, they were treated as symbols of the family's legacy, trained to behave with elegance, discipline, and authority. Yet their upbringing was unusual in one specific way. From the moment they could walk, each twin was assigned a young enslaved boy, only a few years older than them, whose sole responsibility was to escort, assist, and attend to her needs as she grew. The plantation owners believed this would make the girls refined and accustomed to control, but it planted the seeds of something no one anticipated. The twins grew up surrounded by adults who enforced distance, hierarchy, and strict separation between themselves and those who labored around them. But children do not understand social lines the way adults do. To the twins, the boys assigned to them were not symbols of a system. They were simply the closest companions they had. The boys carried their books, followed them to lessons, accompanied them during chores, ran beside their horses, and waited patiently whenever the girls were scolded or corrected. As the years passed, the daily presence of these boys shaped the sisters' worldview more than the fine tutors, visiting ministers, or stern family rules ever could. Because the twins were rarely separated from these companions, they grew into adolescence with a sense of familiarity that defied the plantation's expectations. They noticed things their elders ignored: the boys' intelligence, their resourcefulness, the quiet ways they protected the girls from trouble, and the silent endurance they showed when punished for things they didn't do. The twins began to see the boys as individuals rather than roles assigned to them. They shared jokes when no one was listening, small discoveries in the fields, and stories whispered during long walks the adults thought were supervised. By the time the twins reached their late teens, people on the plantation had already begun to whisper. They saw the way one twin paused when her companion was struck for a minor mistake. They noticed how the other twin would place herself between her assigned boy and a shouting overseer. The sisters had not been taught to care about consequences. They had been taught to command. Yet every time one of the boys was punished, the twins took it personally, reacting with anger or a quiet, dangerous calm that unsettled older family members. The most unusual part of their upbringing was that the twins had almost no friends their own age. Their parents kept them sheltered, convinced that keeping them isolated would mold them into perfect Southern ladies. But isolation works differently when the only people allowed near you are the same two boys every single day. The twins learned to trust them more than their own relatives. They confided secrets in them that they would never dare say aloud at the dinner table. They asked questions adults refused to answer, questions about freedom, fairness, fear, and fate. And the boys, careful and cautious, answered only in fragments, but enough for the girls to sense the truth behind the life they themselves had been shielded from. As they reached adulthood, the relationship had transformed into something deeper than companionship. Though still unspoken, the twins felt a loyalty that challenged everything they had been taught. They no longer saw themselves as masters and attendants. They saw themselves as four people trapped in a system none of them had chosen. The boys saw something equally unexpected. Two young women beginning to question the very world that raised them to believe they were untouchable. It was during these years that the bond became undeniable. Even to outsiders, the twins refused to switch attendants against household custom. They demanded the boys accompany them during lessons where they were not required. They grew irritated when overseers shouted near them. Their protectiveness grew bold, and the adults began to worry. What had started as a training strategy, giving each girl a personal servant to reinforce her authority, had backfired. Instead of creating obedience, the arrangement created connection. The upbringing that was supposed to reinforce separation had instead produced the opposite effect. The twins did not grow up feeling superior. They grew up side by side with two boys who became the only constant presence in their lives. And by the time the plantation realized what their closeness had evolved into, it was far too late. The bond the four of them shared had formed under years of silence, companionship, and mutual trust, and nothing, not tradition, not punishment, not threats, could untangle it anymore. From the outside, the connection between the twins and the two young men seemed harmless at first. To most people on the plantation, it looked like nothing more than routine companionship. The girls walked, the boys followed, the girls studied, the boys waited. But beneath that surface, something more deliberate and unusual began forming, one quiet moment at a time. It started with small acts of trust that the adults around them never noticed or never imagined could carry meaning. What the plantation saw as normal obedience, the twins experienced as a growing bond, one built in silence and shaped by shared years of proximity. As the girls entered their teenage years, their world became more controlled. Their parents, worried about reputation and etiquette, tightened restrictions around them. Lessons became longer, social rules stricter, and punishments for disobedience more severe. Yet the more the adults tried to distance the sisters from outside influences, the more the twins relied on the young men who had been by their side since childhood. The boys became the only people the twins could speak freely with, the only ones untouched by judgment or expectations. In a household where every gesture was watched, the boys provided them with a rare space where their own thoughts could breathe. At first, the alliance between them formed through simple gestures. The young men began warning the twins about approaching overseers when the girls desperately wanted a moment of privacy. The twins, in return, began covering for the boys whenever harsh authority figures searched for excuses to punish them. When one boy fell ill during a long summer, the sister assigned to him skipped her sewing lessons to bring him water and comfort, risking her own discipline. When another boy was blamed for a broken lantern, it was the other twin who calmly lied to protect him, placing herself in danger of a lecture she knew would last hours. These were small acts, almost invisible. Yet each one pulled the four of them closer. None of them ever spoke openly about this loyalty. It was too dangerous. But in the way the boys positioned themselves beside the twins with subtle defiance, and in the way the girls quietly placed themselves between their companions and any potential harm, an unspoken alliance was taking shape. The twins stopped thinking of the men as servants. They saw them as the only people in their world who treated them honestly. In turn, the young men understood the twins in a way no one else did, recognizing their curiosity, their frustrations, and the silent resistance growing inside them. As tension on the plantation increased, arguments among the adults, rising unrest among the workers, the twins began asking deeper questions. They wanted to know what the young men dreamed of, what freedom meant to them, what danger felt like to someone who was never protected. The boys answered with caution, but the honesty in their voices shaped the girls' understanding of the world in ways no tutor ever could. Through these conversations, the alliance transformed from childhood closeness into a deliberate bond, something chosen, not merely inherited. There were moments when the danger of their connection became unmistakable. A passing visitor once noted how strangely unified the twins and the two young men seemed, how they walked almost in sync, how the boys anticipated the girls' needs without being told. A teacher noticed how the twins seemed distracted whenever their companions were punished or questioned. These small observations circulated as whispers, but no one on the plantation believed that such a bond could be intentional. They assumed the girls were simply indulging in youthful stubbornness. But the truth ran deeper. When one of the twins overheard plans to reassign the boys to heavier labor, it was she who intervened with a carefully crafted plea to her parents, pretending to be afraid of new attendants. When one of the boys was nearly caught with a book he wasn't allowed to read, the other twins smuggled it back to safety during her music lesson. These choices were no longer accidental. They reflected a loyalty quietly built over years. A loyalty the adults could not see because they had never considered the possibility. The alliance grew not through dramatic declarations, but through steady, consistent acts, protection, trust, and an understanding that they were four people navigating a system none of them fully believed in. The girls, raised to command, and the boys raised to obey, found themselves breaking those roles in small ways that eventually led to something far greater than anyone expected. By the time the plantation began noticing the unusual unity among them, the alliance was already firmly in place. What had formed in childhood had matured into a silent pact: protect each other, trust each other, and question every rule designed to keep them apart. The silent rebellion didn't begin with dramatic gestures or bold statements. It began in the smallest, quietest moments, moments so subtle that anyone standing a few feet away would have missed them entirely. The twins were raised to see themselves as the center of the plantation's hierarchy, while the two young men were raised to move through life unnoticed, heads down, steps measured. Yet over time, their shared years, frustrations, and quiet observations created a bond that broke the roles they were meant to occupy. The rebellion grew naturally, almost invisibly, shaped not by intention but by instinct, a human response to companionship that had been forced into closeness since childhood. It began on the days when the overseers patrolled more aggressively, shouting orders at anyone who moved too slowly or spoke too loudly. The twins noticed the tension long before adults assumed they would. They saw the way the young men stiffened whenever heavy boots approached. The way their eyes flicked toward escape routes, even during something as simple as bringing water. Without planning it, the sisters adjusted their own behavior to shield them. They walked slower to force overseers to soften their pace. They asked pointless questions to distract supervisors from noticing the boys' tired movements. And when the shouting grew too harsh, one twin would step forward with a tone that froze everyone around her, reminding the adults that she was someone they couldn't discipline so easily. For the boys, the rebellion took shape through quiet acts of care, gestures that protected the twins in ways no one else could. When a tutor became overly harsh during lessons, it was the boys who gently placed the chairs closer to the window so the sisters could breathe easier. When the girls attempted to explore the plantation's wooded edges, it was the boys who cleared the path of thorns and whispered warnings about places they should avoid. They began anticipating the twins' moods, noticing when they needed silence and when they needed to laugh. None of these actions were dramatic, but they were acts of loyalty, and loyalty was dangerous in a world built on fear. Their rebellion also grew through secret exchanges of knowledge. The twins began asking questions they were not supposed to ask. About the laborers' lives, about the punishments that were whispered about but never discussed openly, about why certain rules existed at all. The young men answered with caution, but the honesty in their voices carried truths that broadened the girls' understanding beyond the polished narratives their parents insisted on. In return, the twins shared bits of information overheard in dining rooms and parlors. Details about decisions the plantation owners were planning, meetings scheduled, threats spoken behind closed doors. These small exchanges shifted power in subtle ways the adults never realized. There were times when the rebellion showed itself more clearly, though still in ways that could be dismissed if anyone questioned them. When one of the boys was blamed for misplacing a ledger he had never touched, it was one twin who stepped forward and calmly stated that she had given him different instructions. A lie that redirected anger away from him. When one twin fell ill and her parents refused to let her companion inside the house, the other twin intervened, reminding them that he knew her habits better than the household staff. Her argument was framed as practicality, but the truth was loyalty. Each act of defiance strengthened their sense of unity. It wasn't a conspiracy, it was survival, a shared recognition that none of them truly belonged to the world they lived in. The twins no longer accepted everything they were taught, and the boys no longer behaved as if their only purpose was obedience. They moved together with a quiet rhythm, one built through years of observation and unspoken understanding. The most striking part of this silent rebellion was that it was completely unplanned. No one had discussed it. No one suggested forming an alliance. It simply grew as an instinctive response. Four young people recognizing that they trusted each other more than anyone else around them. And in a place where every rule depended on strict separation, the mere act of trusting one another, deeply, consistently, and across boundaries that were never meant to bend, was rebellion enough to change the course of their lives. By the time outsiders began noticing the quiet harmony between the twins and the young men, the rebellion had already taken root. It was woven into their routines, their glances, their smallest decisions. and the adults, distracted by maintaining control, never realized that the most powerful resistance was happening right in front of them, not through open defiance, but through the steady, silent loyalty of 4 people who refused to believe the roles they had been assigned. The pact did not happen in a single dramatic moment. There was no candlelit meeting, no whispered vows in the dark. Instead, it formed slowly, shaped by months of tension, fear, and the growing realization that the world around them would never allow the 4 of them to exist in peace. By the time the twins reached 17, the entire plantation had changed. The girls were being prepared for arranged futures they wanted no part of, and the young men were facing the threat of reassignment to harsher labor as they grew older and stronger. The adults saw each of them as pieces to be moved, controlled, or used, never imagining that their long years of shared life had created its own future, one that didn't fit the plan laid out for them. The idea of the pact began as an unspoken refusal. The twins resisted the increasing pressure from their parents, who were pushing them toward matches with wealthy neighboring families. They sensed the fear in the boys as rumors spread that certain enslaved men were being considered for sale to cover plantation costs. Each day brought a new worry, and each worry brought them closer to making a choice none of them could have predicted when they were children. The girls had grown up watching decisions being made for them without their opinion, but for the first time, they felt a deep, uncontrollable instinct to protect the only 2 people who had never lied to them, never tried to shape them, never demanded anything from them other than simple trust. One afternoon, after a particularly harsh argument between the twins and their mother about the suitors being considered, the 4 of them found themselves alone near the edge of the fields. A rare moment of privacy. The boys looked afraid to speak, aware that even being seen alone with the sisters could lead to punishment. But it was the twins who broke the silence. They didn't confess emotions or make declarations. Instead, one of them simply said she wouldn't go through with the future being planned. The other quietly agreed. The young men exchanged a glance that held 100 unspoken questions, and for the first time, the girls asked them directly what they wanted, something no one had ever asked them in their entire lives. Their answers were careful, shaped by years of caution, but honest enough to change everything. The boys didn't speak of dreams or dramatic escapes. They talked about staying together, about not being separated, about the small freedoms they valued, walking without fear, choosing where to stand, deciding who they spoke to. The simplicity of their words struck the twins harder than any lecture or sermon ever had. At that moment, the sisters understood that they were the only ones who could determine whether the 4 of them stayed together or were torn apart. The pact, when it finally took form, was not romantic or dramatic. It was practical, protective, and born from survival. The twins agreed that they would refuse every attempt to pair them with wealthy suitors. If pressed, they would claim illness, weakness, spiritual conflict, anything to delay or derail the arrangements. The boys promised to stay close, to trust the twins' decisions even when the risks were high. And most importantly, the pact meant this: no one would be separated from the others without resistance. The girls vowed to use their position to shield the young men from reassignment or sale, and the boys vowed to protect the twins from the punishments that could follow. From that moment on, They moved with a new sense of purpose. Their eyes searched for danger before it appeared. Their choices became deliberate. The twins disrupted every matchmaking effort with perfect composure, while the boys avoided situations that could lead to blame or suspicion. The pact wasn't spoken of again, not because they forgot about it, but because speaking of it wasn't necessary. It was understood in every quiet glance, every shared risk, every time the girls stepped in front of an angry overseer or the boys intercepted a threat before it reached them. In a world where every relationship had a rule, every bond had a boundary, and every life had been mapped out long before birth, the pact was their way of claiming a future of their own. However fragile, however dangerous, it was a promise that none of them would allow the plantation to decide their fate. And even though no one else knew of its existence, the pact began shaping their actions, their courage, and ultimately the path their story would take. A path no one on the plantation was prepared for. The discovery of the pact did not happen through a confession or a careless mistake. It unfolded slowly, like a shadow spreading across the plantation, noticed first by those who paid attention to the smallest shifts in behavior. The girls' parents began to sense that something was wrong when every one of their carefully arranged plans seemed to fall apart in ways that felt too synchronized to be coincidence. A suitor would arrive only to find one twin mysteriously ill. Another would write a letter of interest and receive a polite but unusually cold reply drafted by the sisters themselves. At first, the adults chalked it up to youthful stubbornness. But as the pattern repeated again and again, suspicion began to grow. What truly alarmed the household wasn't the failed matchmaking. It was the twins' newfound certainty. They moved with a quiet confidence that did not fit the expectations of two young women supposedly overwhelmed by the pressures of adulthood. Their choices were too deliberate, their refusals too gentle but unshakable. The adults noticed how the young men assigned to them always seemed nearby, always ready, always calm when the twins appeared distressed. The timing was too perfect. The parents began to wonder if their daughters were being influenced, though they could not imagine how or why. The first clear sign came when the overseer reported an unusual exchange between one twin and her companion. He claimed her tone was protective, almost commanding in a way that suggested the boy held a place in her trust that no servant should ever hold. That report unsettled the family more than they admitted. They began watching the four of them closely, paying attention to moments they had long ignored. They saw the way the twins paused when their attendants were reprimanded. They noticed the boys' quiet vigilance whenever the girls argued with their mother. What once looked like routine obedience began to look like coordination, something purposeful and deeply troubling. The turning point came during a dinner with a visiting family. One of the sisters was asked directly about her future marriage plans, and instead of offering a polite, vague answer, she calmly stated that she had no intention of leaving the plantation unless certain people were allowed to stay with her. The room fell silent. Her parents stared at her in disbelief, searching her expression for some sign that she didn't truly mean what she'd said. But her composed smile offered no comfort. It wasn't her defiance that disturbed them. It was her certainty, a certainty that suggested she believed she had the power to protect the ones she spoke of. After that night, the household erupted in quiet panic. The parents began questioning their daughters separately, hoping to uncover the source of this unreasonable loyalty. The twins said nothing, answering with carefully chosen words that revealed nothing and confirmed everything. Their silence formed its own confession. And when the adults questioned the young men, they received only respectful, measured responses. But the steadiness in their voices, the lack of fear, convinced the interrogators that something had shifted. Rumors spread quickly among the staff and the laborers. Whispers of a secret understanding circulated. Though no one knew the details, people spoke in low voices about the twins' unusual protectiveness and the boys' calm acceptance of risk. In a place built on strict hierarchy, the idea of an alliance was threatening enough to ignite unrest. Tension thickened in the air, felt in every corner of the estate. The conflict erupted when the parents announced a sudden decision to send one of the young men to another property owned by a distant relative. They framed it as a routine reassignment, but their true motive was to break whatever influence they believed he had over their daughter. The reaction was immediate and unprecedented. One sister publicly refused the order, her voice sharp and unwavering. The other stood beside her without needing to speak. And before anyone could stop them, the second young man stepped forward, not to argue, but simply to stand closer to the sisters, silently declaring that the four of them were bound by something stronger than rank or rules. The adults saw everything they feared in that moment. A unity that should have been impossible. A partnership that challenged the very foundation of their authority. The rebellion they had overlooked for years now stood openly in front of them. Not in shouts or violence, but in the simple act of four young people refusing to be separated. That single moment shattered every illusion of control the plantation owners believed they held. Their attempts to intervene only deepened the conflict, sparking arguments, threats, and a tension that carried through every conversation afterward. And though no one ever spoke the word Pact aloud, everyone understood that something had been forged in silence long before its discovery. Something powerful enough to change the fate of all four of them. Their secret pact began on a night when the pressure of their rigid world finally became too heavy to ignore, and the twins realized that the only people who understood their fears were the two men who had grown up in the same house yet never been treated as part of it. The four of them moved through life with the same unspoken awareness of danger and the same desire to escape the paths chosen for them, and that shared struggle slowly shaped a bond that defied the expectations of everyone around them. Their connection was not driven by rebellion alone, but by a deep sense of recognition, as if each of them had discovered someone who saw their real self beneath the role society forced upon them. Together they built a hidden promise to stand by one another, even knowing that any mistake, any misplaced word, or even a single watchful eye could destroy everything they were trying to protect. Their decision to break from the future chosen for them did not begin with a loud moment or a dramatic reveal, but with a series of small shared silences that grew heavier each passing day and slowly pushed them toward a truth none of them could avoid. The twins had spent their lives being told who they were supposed to be and what kind of men they were expected to marry, while the two young men had been raised under the same roof, yet always kept at a distance, never allowed to imagine a life of their own. Every glance exchanged in the narrow halls, every quiet conversation held behind closed doors, and every feeling they tried to bury only tightened the thread that pulled them together, until they reached the point where pretending was no longer possible. What followed was a choice shaped by fear and desire in equal measure, a choice that risked their safety, their families' reputations, and the fragile balance of the household. But it was also the first decision any of them had ever made for themselves, and that truth filled their pact with a power none of them fully understood, yet they could feel it in every heartbeat and every step they took toward the future they secretly wanted. The moment their pact was discovered did not arrive with shouting or sudden rage, but with a quiet shift in the air that every person in the household could feel. Even before the truth was spoken aloud, a single misplaced note, a glance held too long, a door left slightly open at the wrong hour, began to unravel the secrecy they had guarded for months, and the walls that once kept their connection hidden now seemed to echo with every unspoken truth. The twins sensed the change first because they had grown up reading every small sign, every shift in their father's tone, and every shadow that hinted at trouble. They felt the weight of watchful eyes following them through hallways that once felt safe, while the two young men felt the same force pressing close around them, reminding them of the fragile space they lived in, and how easily that space could collapse under suspicion. The house began to breathe differently, and routines that had always been predictable now felt sharp and cold, as if the world they knew was narrowing into a single path with no place to hide. The four of them spent each day waiting for the moment everything would break, trying to protect one another through quick glances and silent signals, as if they could hold back the storm through sheer hope. But the truth had already slipped into the open, carried not by anger, but by unease and misunderstanding and fear of anything that challenged the rules of their world. Rumors spread softly from room to room, carried by people who did not know the full story, yet sensed that something forbidden had taken root within the walls. The twins felt the ground beneath them shifting, while the two young men felt the old weight of expectation returning stronger than before, and none of them could tell how much time remained before the quiet danger became a force too powerful to stop. Each night, the four met in the faint glow of candlelight, speaking little, because words felt too fragile to hold the fear that lived inside all of them, and yet none of them wished to retreat, because stepping away from their bond felt like losing the only honest part of their lives. The discovery of their vow was not a sudden strike, but a slow tightening of tension that reached into every corner of their days, testing their resolve and their courage and the depth of the connection they had chosen to build together. Even as the walls closed in around them, they clung to the silent belief that something born from truth and loyalty deserved a chance to stand against the forces gathering outside, and in that belief they found a strength that carried them into the uncertain days that followed.